In this week's lesson, you learn the rules for formulating the future tense stem from present tense stems where those are formed regularly. That is to say, where they are formed simply by the addition of a sigma to the end of the present tense stem. Many of the verbs that you have already encountered in the vocabulary, or will shortly encounter in the vocabulary, do in fact form their future regularly from their present, with this addition of the sigma. Thus, ago, I lead, becomes axo, I will lead. Akuo, I hear, becomes akuso, I will hear. Anoigo, I open, becomes anoixo, I will open. Apoluo, I destroy, becomes apoluso. Archo, I begin, I rule, becomes arxo, I will rule. Baptizo becomes baptizo, I baptize, I will baptize. Blepo, I see, would itself normally become blepso, I will see. We just don't happen to see the future of blepo in the New Testament. Grapho becomes grapso. Grapho, I write. Grapso, I will write. Didasco, I teach, becomes didaxo. Both the sigma and kappa blend with the following sigma to give us the xi, didaxo, as the sign that a sigma has been added to didasco. Doxazo, I glorify, becomes doxaso, I will glorify. Hetoimazo, I prepare, becomes hetoimaso, I will prepare. Therapeuo, I heal, becomes therapeuso, I will heal. Keruso, I preach, becomes keruxo, I will preach. The double sigma acts as the other gutturals, gamma, kappa, and chi, when another sigma, the sigma indicating the future tense, is joined at the end of that stem. Luo, of course, becomes luso. Pempo, I send, becomes pempso, I will send. Petho, I persuade, becomes peso, because theta is one of the dentals, tau, delta, theta, and zeta, and these all simply drop before the sigma when you're adding the future tense signifier sigma to the present tense stem. Pisteuo, I believe, becomes pisteuso, I will believe, or I will trust. Sun ago, I gather together, becomes sun axo, that's just a compound of ago, axo. So many of these verbs are formed quite regularly, moving from the first to the second principal part, from the present active indicative to the future active indicative. But you also will encounter forms where the future tense stem simply cannot be derived from the present tense stem by any normal set of rules. And in Croy's grammar, these are all set apart in a final paragraph in Lesson 12. I just want to work through some of these with you to explain the irregularities, which in the end will probably not make it easier to memorize them, but might at least make it more explicable how we've gone from one to the other. The first two examples I've put here are ginomai and dunamai. And the issue in Greek is that sigma simply doesn't get added to a nu, or any so-called liquid consonant. These are the consonants that aren't short and momentary like P, P, B, K, or what have you, but rather consonants that can just flow on and on and on, like and and ooh. And if you're really good with breath control, rrr. So lambda, mu, nu, and rho are all liquid consonants, and it's just not possible to stick a sigma onto one of these. Which is why, by the way, you won't be learning the future of verbs like meno for some time, or krino. They're formed differently because of this, this problem with joining a liquid consonant and a sigma. But sometimes the Greeks found a way to make it work. And so with ginomai and dunamai, it works because of the addition, in effect, of a vowel between the stem and the sigma. So ginomai becoming genesomai is as close to regular as Greeks could have made this verb, given the impossibility of putting liquids and sigmas together. Now, why is that impossible? I couldn't tell you. Dunamai, similarly, dunesomai. So to form the future, in effect, they treated these stems not as if they ended with a liquid, the nu, but as if they ended with a short vowel, which was then lengthened into eta to join that stem to the sigma. Heorisko could have been formed regularly. It could have been heorixo, along the analogy of didasko, didaxo. But instead, we find heoreso. And in large measure, this is because the basic stem of the verb to find is not heorisk, but simply heor. These three letters make up the stem that you will also find in the third and sixth principal parts. So again, because this stem ends in a liquid, there are issues with joining it to the regular sigma of the future. So in this case, the Greeks created it in the same way they did with ginomai and dunamai, by lengthening a vowel between the stem, heor, between the liquid consonant and the sigma, allowing us to have heoreso. Ginosko looks a bit more irregular as you move into the future, in part because you have both a stem change and you move from an active form in the present, where you can have active and middle and passive forms, to a middle form in the future. There are no future active forms of gnosko, there are only future middle forms, and those essentially have the same meaning as an active form would, I will know. Knowing is one of those verbs that can't possibly be transitive, can't possibly have an object, and so whether it's active or middle makes very little difference, and in fact the only person affected really by this verb is the subject, which is why I suppose Greek naturally found middle forms to be just as good and in the future to supplant active forms. So we find nos omai instead of noso, as we might expect, and also the stem, the basic stem of this verb, as with heorisko, is not ginosk, it's actually simply gamma nu omicron, gno, and it's really the present form that's more irregular than the other forms. The form gamma, nu, and omicron really undergirds the future principal part, that omicron is lengthened to omega before a sigma is added. And we'll find the gamma, nu, omicron stem again in the aorist. Thaumasdo isn't really all that irregular. We do find normal forms of the future like we would expect. Thaumasso, I will marvel. It just also shows up in the future middle, as well as the future active, all meaning the same thing, I will marvel. Again, it's one of those verbs that has no even possibility of an object. The person who is affected by the action of marveling is the subject. So again, middle forms work just as well for the Greek speaker or writer as active forms. In some tenses, it works better. So we find more future middles than future actives of this verb. That's not really irregular at all. Echo, I have, is almost formed regularly. By the regular rules, the future of echo would be exo. The only irregularity is the fact that for some reason the breathing becomes rough in the future. So instead of exo, the future is actually hexo. So that's a modest irregularity with that particular verb. Now the bottom four are slightly more problematic irregularities. Let's start with lambano here, I take, because actually that's the least problematic in a sense. The stem, the essential stem of lambano is actually lab without the mu. Just simply lambda, alpha, beta. So when that stem has a sigma added to it, we shouldn't be surprised then to find a psi, lambda. Well, actually, the mu is a bit of a surprise there, isn't it? Yeah, so that's a little bit odd. The lengthening of this vowel from alpha to eta is quite inexplicable, but the psi makes good sense. The move to middle is also quite inexplicable, all the more as, well, maybe not inexplicable, but surprising, all the more as this verb takes obviously direct objects and is transitive. I will take almost demands an object, and yet in the future Greeks chose to use middle forms, perhaps underlining the fact that the subject in taking acts upon himself or herself as well, because what you take, you get. The taking is for yourself, which is often a way to bring out the meaning of the middle voice in where it appears truly, not in deponent verbs. Now the other three verbs will look even stranger as you move from the present to the future, but in all three of these cases what's actually happened is that the present tense of one verb is working together with the future tense of another verb to form the complete verb system for that action. So erchomai, I come or I go, usually I come, is from one stem, erch. Eleusamai is from a completely different stem, eleu. There was hypothetically originally a verb eleuo, which would also mean I come. And it was formed, or maybe eleuomai, I come. And its future was formed regularly, eleusamai. But in the passing of time, Greeks tended to use verb a, the one built on the stem erch, for coming in the present tense, or the imperfect tense, and the stem from verb be, from eleuo, or eleuomai, to talk about coming in the future. So there is really no relation lexically between these two forms whatsoever. This is very much like our go and went in English, where principal parts of different verbs now work together as if they were one verb, but historically they were separate verbs. Estheo is another example of this. Estheo is a verb used to talk about eating in the present, but phagomai comes from a completely different verbal root, phag, and that root is used to talk about eating both in the future and in the aorist, the more or less simple past tense. So again, principal parts of one verb based on the stem esth or esthi give us our way to talk about eating in Greek in the present and the imperfect. But the principal parts from a completely different verb, one with the stem phag, give us our way of talking about eating in the future and the aorist. The other oddity is that the verb phag in the future is deponent. It only exists in the middle voice, which again kind of makes sense when you think about the overall sense of middle voice being the voice that you use when you emphasize the subject being acted upon or benefiting from the action also. So even while phagomai is transitive and regularly takes objects, you always eat something, the subject is the one benefiting from the eating or affected by the action of eating. Maybe not as much as the thing eaten, but you get the idea. And then phero also combines the principal parts of different verbs across its system. So phero, based on the root fer, is the principal part used to talk about bringing in the present or in the imperfect, but a completely different verb. Perhaps that was originally oyo, I bring. So with the future formed regularly, oiso, I will bring. That verb now supplies the way of talking about bringing in the future. And as we'll see next week, yet a third verb that talks about bringing or carrying supplies forms for talking about bringing in the simple past, the aorist. Again, verbs like these, erchomai and estheo and phero, these are not displaying irregular formations so much as the combination of specific principal parts of different verbs that are now functioning together, which nevertheless we tend to need to memorize so that we are able to relate these verbs all together. So when we see oiso, we know that we're really talking about the future of phero. We're talking about bringing in the future, so we can link these meanings and these principal parts together. There is a very fine resource that helps with this. It's called Lexical Aids for Students of New Testament Greek. It was compiled by Bruce Metzger, one of the great minds behind the translation of the New Revised Standard Version, in fact. A great New Testament scholar and one with a very important legacy in that regard. It's published now by Baker Bookhouse, and it has tables of principal parts in the back. Actually, only a few pages. So it might be worth getting this from the library and copying those pages, or getting the whole thing and using it as, in fact, an aid to getting a basic New Testament vocabulary down. But in this instance, I recommend it mostly for tables of irregular principal parts. Actually, most Greek grammars also have such a table to help students along, and indeed, even in the back of Clayton Croy's book, in the vocabulary section, for example, the Greek to English vocabulary, where there are irregular parts of a verb, those tend to be given alongside the first principal part in the vocabulary. And there are no doubt similar helps available across the web for connecting these strange principal parts with each other into meaningful groups.